In Kulileko, Alan, we can get started, right?
Yes, Chair.
All right, it's 9 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. Today, we've got a program which I think has been sent out to you. The first 30 minutes or so will be National Treasury responding to both the written and the oral submissions that were made before us on Wednesday. And then thereafter, we allocate about 30 minutes or so. I think if I hold us those who are present, Nkululeko will help and Ellen and identify them. And then we give Treasury a brief reply, and then we throw it open that I gather is allocated for discussion. Also to remind society that this is only one of 3 public hearings we have on the adjustments budget. The others are on the division of revenue next Friday, the 14th. And then I'm told on the 24th of this month also, there'll be hearings on the appropriations bill. So there's 3 different aspects of the public hearings. This is in response to C19 and the other civil society stakeholders as well, complaining about the lack of time. So you also, C19 and others have a right to appear before the Appropriations Committee. In the case of C19 in particular, both the committee secretary, Mr. Mangweni, and Nkululeko and myself referred to Lubabalo, who actually, I spoke with him this morning and confirmed that he spoke to Sacha, I think, and they've invited C9 10th of July hearing next Friday, because many of their issues deal less with the fiscal framework, with macroeconomic issues, than with actually conditional grants. So they've been invited next Friday to take their issues forward, and the chairperson, Lady Mashlangu, is also part of this meeting. Presumably she'll process that too. Having said that, Comrade Joe, co-chair, do you have anything you want to say before we hand over to Treasury?
No, not for now. You can proceed, Chairperson.
Okay, so the chairs have agreed that I'll do the first half and the co-chair will do the second half. So over then to Treasury. This was distributed, colleagues, comrades, this morning. So presumably some of you at least have had a chance to go through it. And then, of course, the Treasury will take us through it right now. So who's here from the Treasury team in Nkululeko? Sorry?
Chairperson Edgar Sichi will do the presentation as far as I know.
Will others kindly mute their facility, please? We can hear a lot of...
Morning, Chair. It's Willie Oakham. Can I say something?
I think it's Nakolo, is it? Yeah, no, it's all off now. Good, go for it. Edgar Sishi is there. Thank you. DDG.
Sorry, Chair, it's Willie Oakham speaking. Can I quickly say something, please?
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Chair, I've got a meeting with the Magistrates Commission that's also scheduled for today. It's a bit later, but if you would just excuse me, if I'm going to hop off at a certain stage, when we finish, I'll come back on this meeting as well. I consider
that is taking place. Thank you so much for letting us know. Yes, can we quickly take apologies? In Nkululeko, anybody from the Select Committee side?
No apologies, Chair, from our side. Only it was Mr. Oakham.
Yes, of course. And then on the side of the NA, Alan, any apologies?
No.
Okay, good. And you've notified all the stakeholders, you sent out that letter, and presumably those who can make it have made it today, right? Is that correct?
We have done that, yes.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, all right. You'll identify them when we come to their chance to respond. I did see Comrade Matthew Parks here. Okay, let's go over then to Treasury.
Chair, thank you very much. This is Dondomo Khajani. Edgar, I'll just make a few remarks and Edgar will come with your petition.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair. And honorable members, thank you for this opportunity to respond to the submissions made to this committee on the special adjustments budget tabled by the Minister of Finance on the 24th of June 2020. The Treasury strongly supports these public engagements on the budget, and the Treasury team is here to provide a comprehensive set of responses for today's hearing. Honorable Chair, the Parliament should not be deceived and misled. Our understanding of Parliament's process is that it is not only meant to be constructive while being robust, but it should also be fact-based and relevant. Although these committees are a public platform, they should not be used to advance false, misleading, or politically serving motives by some other groups outside Parliament and outside government. In our view, the submissions from certain groups, in particular the Budget Justice Coalition and the group of economists, are empirically false and misleading. They also adopt a tone which appears to reject the principle of social partnership in favor of media sensation. Their submissions have several factually inaccurate assertions, which seem to be meant to deceive these committees. They also seem eager to launch baseless and politically motivated attacks against the National Treasury and the Minister of Finance. I shall highlight just two examples of this. First, in its submission to the committee, the group of economists states that the budget reneges on, and I quote, budget reneges on the President's economic intervention measures as announced on the 21st of April 2020, in part because a large part of the budget is funded through reprioritization of the baseline allocations. Let me remind honorable members of the Parliament statements the President made, and I quote, the impact of the coronavirus requires an extraordinary budget of around 500 billion to direct resources towards fighting the pandemic, which will include the reprioritization of around 130 billion within the current budget, close quote. So, Chair, with the President's directive in this regard. In addition, the decision by the President and government at large to focus on reprioritization should be the decision by the President and government at large, should be seen as a good initiative to target low priority, low efficiency and wasteful expenditure in the system, and should be applauded as such. Yet the Economist submission, as well as the Budget Justice Coalition, falsely claim that the reprioritization comes from the Treasury in favor of a strategy of twisting the facts. The Parliamentary Budget Office also seemed to have fallen into the misguided view that spending should increase on a net basis by 500 billion, even though the President did not say this. But at least the Parliamentary Budget Office does not go into the kind of misrepresentation of the two groups I'm talking about. They go so far as to tell members that, and I quote, it would be dereliction of duty for members to vote for the budget. This is not an argument. It is an attempted manipulation without empirical analysis, Chair. This brings me to the second observation. The Budget Justice Coalition and the group of economists on government's policy making score points. The Budget Justice Coalition claims that we have, and I quote, little understanding of the state's constitutional obligations, close quote. And the economists claim that what the minister tabled betrays the President. No data is provided to justify this, except that these groups don't like the way the money is allocated. These are political statements, not economic statements, and we wonder why they are being made here. There are other factually inaccurate assertions, Chair, by these groups, such as on tax relief and deliberate ignoring of key job protection measure. But my main point, Chairperson, is that Parliament should be wary of allowing itself to be used as a platform for false, misleading statements. In conclusion, Chair, the team will provide the detailed responses. But let me broadly reiterate the factual and empirical information regarding this supplementary budget. First, this budget raises government spending in response to the COVID pandemic. It allows the budget deficit to become huge and frankly unsustainable. Second, this budget responds to changing circumstances on the ground. So, for example, health receives more funding than what was announced. Government is exercising its responsibility to ensure sustainability and prevent a collapse in the public finances that many South Africans depend on. We are not a reckless national treasury or a treasury that will jeopardize the fiscal future of this country and future generations. We call on social partners to make meaningful contributions to our collective economic future. I thank you, Chair. And Chair, I would request that you give us a permission for Edgar to then give us a detailed response based on the submission and the presentation that is in front of the House. Thank you very much.
DG, firstly, are you going to be staying for the whole meeting?
Yes, Chair, I will be staying for the whole meeting, yes.
Okay, because I think as a chair, I have to respond to what you say.
Yeah, we have to respond, Chair, because We can't intimidate people who come and make submissions in Parliament. It's unacceptable.
Floyd, you have no right to speak, Floyd. Now you are intimidating the democratic process. I said he just can't say these sweeping things. And almost, I mean, what I find quite offensive is not the substance of what you're saying, DG, but to suggest somehow that we will be misled, like we're naive, foolish, silly, immature people. I mean, there are activists here for over 50 years of standing. And I really think you're free to be robust. It's unprecedented for a DG in the 6 years I've been involved in this finance sector to speak the way you do. But look, robust discussion is allowed. But we will not, as Parliament, just make one point. There's no debate here. It's not something I'm saying individually. It's defined by the norms and the rules of Parliament and our Constitution and the mass democratic struggle we wage to get where we are. People are free to say what they want. But Treasury, you are free also. I mean, usually it's a DM or a minister would say what you said, but fine. But please, you have no right to suggest that we will be used either by civil society or by yourselves, Treasury. We will hold you to rigorous account as well. And finally, DG, perhaps I should say this at the outset so that we get clear that Edgar Sishi sticks to what the norm is. There's nothing wrong what's wrong with that? This is a political terrain. But you're free to say what you want to say, except that some of the things you're saying border on actually insulting the committee, DG, and perhaps other members want to say something. But as a chair, I have no choice but to say it. I'm the chairperson for now. Comrade Joe, if you want to add now, you can. But otherwise, we'll give you a chance, Floyd, to speak. You can be the first speaker when the civil society has responded. But DG, you really have gone further than you should in terms of the norms in respect of your view of how people should engage with this Parliament. Okay, over to you, Edgar Sishi. You've got about 20 minutes, I think. Yeah, 23 minutes. Floyd, you'll be the first speaker when we get to the discussion part from this from the MPs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can hear me. I believe you should be able to hear me. This is our presentation, of course, our response to the submissions over the last couple of days. On the slide is just the list of the submissions as we have them. So I think they're known to members. Just some key comments that we gleaned from the public hearings over the last couple of days. First, just in terms of the broad themes, we consider that the debate on the austerity versus stimulus is came out quite strongly. Secondly, issues of tax policy. Thirdly, on the spending. Fourth, the reforms in terms of economic reforms. And then finally, the financing of government spending. Let me start with the fiscal policy issues and just outline some key facts which we have provided in a great deal of detail in the supplementary budget review, which was tabled on the 24th of June. Firstly, as well as other pieces of information that were tabled before. Firstly, South Africa's fiscal stance has been expansionary for more than a decade. For many years, the spending of government has grown in real terms and has grown much faster than the economy and has grown faster than inflation. Since 2008, average spending of government has grown 4% annually, every year, in real terms, in other words, even accounting for inflation. And the supplementary budget presents the most expansionary budget in many years. It is an unprecedented expansion of the fiscal deficit and an unprecedented increase in government borrowings to a level that, as DG was saying, is frankly unsustainable. This expansion provides one of the most robust responses to the COVID pandemic among developing countries. All of the data that we have looked at, from the OECD, from the IMF, the World Bank, various institutions, proves that this is the case. We have a large cyclically adjusted primary deficit that's bigger than a number of countries, including countries that are larger than ourselves. And the 10% of GDP support is larger than comparable countries in the G20. However, South Africa cannot use the pandemic as an excuse not to address the weak public finances and to achieve higher growth rates in the future. What we do know about government spending is that it's not a novel idea about what government spending has or has not done. We know that higher government spending has not translated into higher growth in the past decade. That is a fact. The austerity versus stimulus debate, however, it does not make policy according to this paradigm. And finally, the reprioritization approach that we have used is a prudent and appropriate approach to funding part of the relief measures. It was announced by the president on the 21st of April, 2020. It is in line with practices in numerous countries worldwide. A number of countries are using reprioritization to fund their COVID responses. And finally, it provides an opportunity to address waste and reduce priority spending in government in respect of being able to redirect it towards the key areas. Some selected observations. Firstly, it is our view, Mr. Chairman, that the rejections of the active scenario that were tabled during the public submissions ignore the prospect and implications of a debt crisis. We noted that in many of the submissions where there was an injunction to spend, for government to spend even more, for the most part, there was no attempt to engage with the prospect of the debt crisis that we have put forward. And so we considered that the passive scenario that we outlined of a debt crisis has not been refuted in the submissions that were made, and neither have the implications of the debt crisis been. The question is, if the prospect and implications of a debt crisis have not been refuted, scenario be rejected. Secondly, while the consolidation effort will be challenging, there are upside risks in respect of the potential of economic growth measures that we are talking about, as well as improvements in inflation dynamics and the terms of trade. Third, calls for more government spending appear to us to be based on the incorrect assumption that South Africa suffers from short-run cyclical demand challenges rather than long-run structural weaknesses in the economy. Fourthly, higher government spending and borrowing, as I've said, has not led to higher growth in many years. And finally, we should not confuse people's desire to lend us money with our ability to pay it back. Turning to the debate on stimulus versus austerity, the COVID-19 economic response, as I've said, is massively countercyclical when measuring the size of the fiscal impulse. We consider that government at this time only has a choice between a looming debt spiral or fundamental reform, and that no other option exists. We need fundamental reform. Thirdly, policy of government is that a structural increase in the level of spending must be matched by increase in structural revenues. And in this regard, we consider that there is a structural gap between spending and revenue in government, and it's been there for many years. There are growth and distributional consequences to our choices. They include the fact that more borrowing does not translate necessarily into higher growth, and that hasn't been the case in a number of years. Fiscal stimulus cannot address underlying structural issues, and rising debt service costs are crowding out other areas of spending, and has been happening over time. And that increasing reliance on foreign savings is raising our vulnerability to external shocks. It's also important to note that we accept the premise, and in this regard, we agree with Kosato and others who make the point that the quality of the borrowing is crucial, and that we have to focus on investment rather than consumption, and we have to make sure that we improve the efficiency of spending by government, which we've been doing. We need to accelerate these efforts. Spending reductions may cause short-term harm, of course, but the implications of a fiscal crisis would be profoundly negative. I do want to remind honourable members of the not only the gap now, but also the structural gap over many years between revenue and expenditure that we have to address. So in terms of the debate around spending, and the calls from the Parliamentary Budget Office, COSATU and others to spend more. One of the things we have to consider are the facts. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated an already very little fiscal space to respond. And this for us, Mr. Chairman, is the critical message that we draw from the current crisis. The message that we draw from the current crisis is not that you need to spend more and more and more, regardless of how indebted you are. It is about the importance of fiscal buffers. We were able to respond very well to the global financial crisis in 2008, partly because we had strong buffers. You have to build up buffers during the good times in order to make sure you can respond to a crisis. Because if you don't have buffers, then your response to the crisis is not only weak or jeopardized, but is potentially leads you to a crisis. Budget 2020 expected an already large deficit of 6.8% of GDP. This has now increased to a consolidated record of 15.7%. The gross borrowing requirement for 2020, which is the sum of the main budget deficit and the loans that are currently maturing, has increased by 344 billion to 777, just under 777 billion rand this year. Debt will peak at 87% in terms of our active scenario in 2020, 23, 24, compared to 50% in 2016, 17, where it was at the time. And this is in the active scenario. If we do nothing, it's of course over 100%. Now this adds to the already high levels of debt and increasing debt service costs to almost 22% of the main budget expenditure. We also consider that South Africa's tax to GDP is already high given country's level of development, and any additional taxes should be considered prudently. And in this regard, I would remind honorable members that our tax collections last year at 26.4% of GDP matched our all-time record as a percentage of the economy, and yet the fiscal gap still grew. And so much work needs to be done in this regard. Additional spending will require higher debt, and this comes with higher interest. And finally, rising debt service costs are crowding out our ability to pay for health and education services. Next year, payment on interest will be higher than spending on health, and the year after that, payment on interest will be higher than total spending on basic education in this country if we do nothing. Week, Thursday, a debt crisis can have long-run implications, and this is a reminder of the conservative analysis that we have done. It shows what happens to debt over the decade and the debt service costs. And even more importantly, on the right-hand side, it shows that that crisis could extract more than 2 trillion rands from the real economy if we do nothing. This is a slide, as you all know, that we've showed many times, reflecting the different choices that we have. And we believe, Mr. Chairman and honorable members, that we can take steps to avoid a debt crisis, and we can place the economy in a path towards higher potential and real growth if we take action. One of the questions that was raised was around the usage of the government employees' pension fund to fund the response. And this slide seeks to provide some information in this regard so that I think we understand the sort of the nature of what we're talking about. The table above shows the income and expenditure of the GEPF, including employer and employees' contributions, as well as the benefits that the GEPF pays out. And you can see across the years how the benefits currently being paid or that have been paid out over a number of years have of course been steadily rising. And at the bottom, you can see the actuarial valuations of the government employees pension fund. The GEPF exists to provide retirement security to about 1.3 million employees and 460,000 beneficiaries, right, and manage government's pension liabilities. Its funding position has, as you can see in these tables, steadily deteriorated since 2016, driven by lower than expected investment returns and introduction of new benefits and improvements to existing benefits. It's also important to note that investments by the fund are determined by the Board of Trustees in terms of an act of Parliament. And forcing the fund to invest in suboptimal assets will create a significant long-run liability for future generations. The fund is reliant on investment income to pay benefits. It is expected that the impact of credit ratings downgrades and the COVID-19 will adversely affect the fund's position. Let me also point out that it is our view, Mr. Chairman, that in order to achieve this, you do need to avoid spending today that has been saved for tomorrow. I want to touch finally on the fiscal policy side on the matter of infrastructure. We fully agree with those and others that infrastructure needs to be a priority, and we are working to make it so. As honorable members will be aware, we tabled,
sorry about that. Can the ICT people please help the IT people? There's these interruptions, but they seem to have disappeared now.
I've muted the person.
Okay.
Sorry.
We consider that interventions to support public infrastructure spending are very important. We, as we have tabled in a previous budget review, establish a 100 billion rand infrastructure fund as the Treasury. We're working very closely with the DBSA in that regard. And we also support the intervention of the Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium. We have a budget facility for infrastructure, which is an institutional process to appraise and evaluate large projects, and funding for the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Council, GTEC, DPSA, to assist government institutions with project preparation and planning has been made available in budgets. We have an infrastructure delivery improvement program to provide technical assistance. And also we have a framework for infrastructure delivery and procurement management, which aims to build efficiencies in the system, including in procurement. And also we have established several local government grants that are designed to augment the infrastructure grants in order to support making the system more efficient. And finally, as I've indicated, the Infrastructure Fund's implementation unit has now been established in the DBSA, and it has identified potential projects in excess of 500 billion rands. And we are busy with the review of the public-private partnership framework of government. And in this regard, we welcome more initiatives and more support and more inputs into this process. Mr. Chairman, the next set of slides are around the tax policy issues that were raised by a number of the contributions that were made. Some comments stated that there should not be any increase in taxes while the economy recovers from the pandemic, while others called for additional tax measures to be introduced. The supplementary budget stated that there would be tax increases of 40 billion over the next 40 years, and that specifics in this regard will be announced in February. The Davis Tax Committee has done a number of research topics on this, a number of research reports on this, including the viability of the wealth tax, how it relates to land tax, estate duty, and we are looking at these recommendations. It's important to remember, honorable members, the tax amendments of the last 5 years have included some of these proposals. And we are looking at additional proposals, of course, for the 2021 budget. Relief measures. Firstly, let me point out there was, I think, a misreading in some of the comments that were made, particularly by the group of economists around the tax relief measures, where they seem to have confused the 70 billion rands in actual tax relief with the 26 billion rand in the direct cost to the fiscus that we outlined in the budget review. Those numbers are perfectly accurate, and there is no discrepancy between the actual economic support being provided by tax relief and the cost to the fiscus, because some of the tax relief measures do not necessarily require the fiscus to give up money. It just requires certain deferrals and other levies to be deferred over some time. So that's important to remember. This slide shows the preliminary data from SARS up until last week of what the take-up on those tax relief measures has been. I'm not going to go through all of this. You can read in your own time, because we have limited time for this presentation. But it does show that there are movements taking place. 9,000 firms are utilizing deferrals. The skills development levy exemption is providing relief. We can see applications coming in on a case-by-case basis for various relief, including from SMME vendors. These slides, Mr. Chairman, are on the economic policy issues. And I wanted my colleagues, my colleague, Dr. Duncan Peterson, if you'll allow, to go through these economic policy slides for us in order to just outline the message. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, he can quickly go through that.
Yes, fine. You're at 27 minutes almost, but fine. We can give you a few more minutes beyond that. Remember, you've also got another 15 minutes after civil society response. Can I suggest, though, you should be more concrete in your responses to exactly what the stakeholders said, and less general, Duncan, please. But you can start with the overview. Duncan?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the members. Yeah, I think what I'll do as I go through the slides is just link it back to specific issues that were raised. I think the point we want to make here is Chair and members, specifically in response to the submissions around whether additional spending with outcomes. So quite a few of the submissions make the argument that, in fact, if we raise spending, that can boost economic growth. And so this slide in particular speaks to that. The first point, which Edgar's already made, is that government expenditure has in fact increased from 27% of GDP in 2009 to just over 32%, without the necessary response on the economic growth side. And part of the reason for that is because, of course, this additional spending has to be financed through additional debt. And what we find is that in our own work, as well as in literature from the rest of the world, is that unsustainable spending, in fact, leads to higher debt, which is associated with lower growth. So fiscal multipliers in emerging markets like ourselves are much smaller than in advanced economies. So that means that for each rand of spending by the fiscus, the impact on growth can often be close to zero or sometimes even negative. In our case, what we have found in our work is that South Africa's fiscal multipliers are very small, and they were possibly even negative before the crisis. And a negative fiscal multiplier means that additional government spending actually leads to a contraction in growth. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but the way it works is because countries that have high debt, they can in fact have high negative multipliers, because fiscal consolidation could actually have positive credibility and confidence effects on private demand. As we said, means that spending increases can in fact contract growth. And given where our levels of debt are, we are at the point where, in fact, additional spending, because it's accompanied by large levels, have a negative impact on growth, because it raises aggregate economic risks, and it increases with it the cost of borrowing in the economy as a whole. One way for the honourable members to think about that is South Africa's risk premium, investors' demand to compensate for higher risk, has actually increased from around 3% at the end of 2019 to just over 5% now. So our investors are saying, we will buy your debt, but we are demanding much, much greater premium in order to buy it, because we are not sure whether you will be able to pay that debt back because your economic growth is so low. And what this has resulted in is reduced investment by the private sector, which has resulted in slower growth and less employment. Next slide, please. On the previous slide, we spoke about less investment, and here the investment story becomes a little bit clearer, because what we can see is that government spending has been on a continuous upward trajectory. So from around 10% of GDP to over 20% of GDP over the last 50 years or so. but gross fixed capital formation has in fact declined and stagnated, and then started declining again in recent years. So it's not always true that higher government spending leads to higher growth, as I said previously, because of the issues around the financing of that expenditure. And what has happened here is that the government spending has in fact overtaken investment as a share of nominal GDP, and investment has begun to decline as an overall share of GDP, following some recovery between 2000 and 2009. And I think, as the honourable members will know, the private sector actually accounts for 60% of GDP, and the remaining 40% of investment in the economy is split between government investment and the state-owned companies, mainly Transnet and Eskom. So what the state needs to be focused on, and I think this is certainly where we agree with COSATU and others, is creating the enabling environment for the private sector to be able to invest, so that 60% of contribution to investment that the private sector makes can in fact boost our growth. Next slide, please. So I think if one comes back to the issue of government spending that has increased, but investment stagnating, and remind ourselves that the private sector in fact contributes 60% of investment, with the remainder mainly coming from state-owned companies in the form of Transnet and Eskom. What that tells us is that what our debt stabilization will require is additional growth by removing some of these structural constraints to growth. And again, just to come back to the inputs that were made, there were a few slides submitted by COSATU, which we absolutely agree with, around the economic interventions and those structural reforms that need to be removed in order to enable investment and employment growth. Many of these issues have been highlighted in the document that was published last year, and the government has started moving towards implementing several of those detailed structural reforms. But I thought, instead of going through them in any amount of detail, I thought I would just highlight what exactly we mean by structural constraints. So a structural constraint is simply something like the fact that at the moment, it is very difficult for Eskom to provide the country with reliable and affordable electricity. So this, of course, is a structural constraint to investment. And so the structural reform in response to that is, how do we leverage our significant renewable energy resources that are also labor intensive in their production in order to, over time, enable a just transition for the electricity sector? So the constraint is affordable and reliable electricity, and the intervention or the structural reform is, how do we leverage renewable energy resources to create jobs and to lower electricity prices and to stabilize electricity supply. Just another structural constraint, which the members will be familiar with: the lowest wage workers in our economy spend 40% of their incomes on transport. And this is a structural constraint that prevents their effective participation in this economy. And so the structural reform there, of course, has to do with, how do we densify our cities, how do we reverse apartheid-era spatial planning, and how do we fix our passenger rail entities. And that then has to do with, how do we modernize our network industries so that we actually have a passenger rail entity that is able to allow our lowest paid workers to effectively participate in this economy. And that would be the structural reform. Next slide, please. So,
Duncan, you're at 35 minutes. If you could please round up, because we'll come back to you. You've got another 15 minutes when we come back. I don't want to be rigid, but our members fine to give them another few minutes. Is that okay?
Last slide, Chair.
Go ahead. Okay.
Is it okay?
Thank you for your indulgence, Chair. Last slide on my side. Just a reminder, As pointed out by COSATU and others, these structural reforms are critical, and we are in absolute agreement with them. Real GDP per capita has declined since 2015. Productivity growth has slowed, and importantly, our investment growth has been negative in 12 of the last 17 quarters. And our economic growth has persistently been worse than expected since 2012. And our potential growth has also declined significantly. And that's why we believe that debt stabilization will require the unlocking of these structural reforms so that we can enable our businesses, our households, and our people to effectively participate in this economy. I've highlighted the main elements of the reform agenda there as well. I won't go through them, but the members will see that this reflects our thinking around how we think we can unlock the structural constraints in this economy and return growth to sustainable levels so that our fiscal sustainability can be restored. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So can we go to COSATU and civil society actors, please? I think in the order they appeared. Has COSATU got anything to say? We've got 30 minutes to share between you if you want that amount of time. So Matthew, do you want to say anything?
Sure. Just quickly, Comrade Chair, and thanks to the colleagues from Treasury. I think just a few quick points, Chair. Look, for us, if we criticize the budget, we're not criticizing just Treasury. We view this as a government budget, and the entire government must take responsibility for the different roles. Look, we would agree with government that the debt trajectory is quite worrying. It's not hitting us so much now, but the projected increase is worrying. And we do know as COSATU, and we have been raising concerns about it, that if we get to the debt trap level, the first ones to suffer would be workers. It would be public servants who would have their wages slashed. It would be workers who will be retrenched, etc. But I think, Chair, our difference with government is about how to resolve it. We think the way to resolve it is to stimulate the economy so we can grow, so we can create jobs, and then we can increase revenues to the state. That's how we'll pay down. We're very worried that if we just simply cut without stimulating the economy, we may end up choking the economy. And so we're looking at examples, Chair, from the EU, the US, China, where they've gone for the stimulus route. But so I think for us, it's about how you resolve it. Chair, I think for us, the fundamental issue is that we're in an economic recession. We already have 40% unemployment levels. We have thousands being retrenched. We might hit 50% unemployment. So it's how to grow the economy, how to create jobs. And our frustration is that the only messages we got out of this budget and the February budget is that we're going to tackle the wage bill and we're going to reduce expenditure. We don't get a plan how we're going to grow the economy, how we're going to create jobs. There's not even a job creation target in the budget. Workers are being retrenched at SOEs and there's no response from the state. Chair, but we agree with government that where will the money come from? And for us, we really had hoped to hear more from government about further interventions to capacitate SARS, further measures to reprioritize expenditure as a...
Thanks, eh?
Okay, cool. Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
Very.
Okay.
I think, Chair, we would have had hoped to hear more about tackling wasteful expenditure and corruption, more about customs enforcements. Chair, on the stimulus plan, just into the last two issues, for us that is critical. And it's not just us as COSATU who sat somewhere and the President of the Republic several times. He had said in his own words, anything less than a 1 trillion rand stimulus plan is not going to cut it. It will not take us out of the recession, out of the unemployment crisis. He has spoken very eloquently about a Marshall Plan equivalent, and we didn't see that in the budget. We know you can't print money. We don't want to go the Zimbabwe route, etc. But for us, what is critical is the infrastructure program, which we support, but it needs to be prioritizing ports, rail, energy, etc. to grow the economy. We would hope to hear more about impact investments because it is critical to get domestic investment, more about job creation. Chair, and it's good that the Treasury is speaking about the regulatory reforms in the economy, but the different departments are not moving with any sense of speed. So we've been talking about digital spectrum for years, auto licensing, no movement. So those are just examples which are blocking economic growth, and we don't understand why government is not showing the leadership to deal with it. Even on the SOEs, Chair, we have not seen clear plans to resolve them. There is some positive movement at ESCOM, which is hopeful, but we need to see much more and to see a bigger role on the DFIs. We agree about the GAPF mandate, Chair, which is critical, but we think there is a need to engage with the PIC about how they invest in ways which grow the economy, which create jobs, etc. Lastly, Chair, I think it would have been good to have seen from government a commitment to reducing what management and what politicians earn on the wage bill. If you want to get workers to compromise, they need to see people on top who are broke in the state, bleeding and making those necessary sacrifices. But let me stop there, Chair, because I know there's time pressures. Thank you.
Okay. C19, are they here in Kululeko? Alan? Anybody?
Yes, Chair.
Okay. Who's here?
Hi. I'm from C19.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to give 3 brief points. Our intervention is mostly about asking, in terms of the grants. We're a group that focuses on the cash grants, and our main comment was that the cash grants has been cut so that it's the total allocation is insufficient in terms of cash transfers needed in this moment of crisis. And now our response to the presentation is really along three lines. Say that while we agree that the debt is extremely important and has been worrying for many years coming, there are kind of 3 responses to it. One is that I think from a perspective of priorities of the budget right now, and we're arguing that there should be a humanitarian kind of priority to the budget. Ultimately, of course, the only use of kind of economic growth and so on is for broader welfare grounds. Special moment right now in terms of the COVID time, where globally there needs to be a reprioritization of short-term humanitarian interventions versus longer-term interventions. And so if that does mean some kind of trade-off along the 5-year horizon to plug certain deep welfare impacts in the near to this kind of 3 to 6 month horizon, that seems well justified. And all of our data to date really indicates significant and severe welfare effects. If we look at everything from unemployment to the levels of hunger and poverty, we've got enormous amounts of data coming in of job impacts, for example, on the level we've never seen before. The second ground is that just that in terms of debt, the COVID moment response to debt is different, and so it's kind of a unique moment which we can leverage, not only in terms of a different response from investors, but also in terms of that this is a temporary increase in debt, potentially to be funding something like grants. It also matters where the debt goes. And so that's why we're kind of arguing for against these cuts to the grants, the 50 billion to 41 billion specifically. And then the third point is just want to agree with the previous comment from Matthew Parks from COSATU, that it would have been nice to see more of a sacrifice across the board, specifically in the form of not only as suggested by Matthew Parks, but also in terms of and the burden taken on by higher income earners. We know the majority of the hit in terms of job loss, but while higher income earners a large degree while having very little job loss, we think that it impact for the kind of 1 year budget for the country, there should be equitable distribution of burden, and that should include tax increase for the rich, which would also help with the budgeting problems. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Paul Hoffman's here. Do you want to say anything?
Just quickly, thank you, Chair. Morning to the committee. I'm disappointed little is said about the effect of grand corruption on the ability of the state to acquit itself of its responsibilities under the Constitution. We know that the spending at the moment is 62 cents in the rand on the wage bill of the state and 22 cents in the rand almost on servicing debt. This is what government has been spending money on And a lot of the money that has been spent by government in other ways has been spent to feed the monster that we call grand corruption. We know that grand corruption is responsible for about 1.5 trillion of state money disappearing into the pockets of the corrupt. That needs to be dealt with if we are going to avoid falling into a sovereign debt trap. We are not going to attract new investment while the investors are lacking in the confidence that the rule of law is intact in South Africa. Impunity that grew so exponentially during the Zuma years has not been brought to an end by reform, structural reform of the criminal justice administration, by the introduction of the Integrity Commission, which will investigate and prosecute grand corruption, as Accountability Now has been asking for since 2012. We came to this committee with 2 points, the one to deal with hunger and the other to suggest a basic income grant. Neither of those were canvassed by Treasury. Maybe they do not believe that hunger is part of their knitting, but they will be introduced to it when starving masses storm the Treasury in search for a crust of bread. Stop the wastage of edible food. 1/3 ends up incinerated or on a landfill. Our other point in relation to the introduction of a basic income grant, I see in my legal brief this morning that Latuli House is engaged in the feasibility of such a grant. So Treasury is going to be asked, where can the money come from for a basic income grant? And the answer is that the state needs to get proactive about raking back the 1.5 trillion that has fallen into the hands of the corrupt. You do that, you will have enough money to with the COVID crisis and to introduce a less inequitable and unequal society in the wake of COVID. Thank you. Those are the submissions for Accountability Now.
Thank you. It's Ota now. Is Ota here in Kululeko?
Yes, Chair.
Quickly, please.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I'll be very brief. I just want to say thank you to National Treasury. I think it's a very robust response, and to the members as well. I think this is the first time that we can really see clearly that there's a direct engagement with the content. So a few points that I would like to make, Chair, and the primary response I'm seeing from National Treasury is essentially a defensive one, which I can understand. But we made recommendations that are largely in line with National Treasury's plan, and we are quite happy with the intention. And just to really get into the specifics and to elaborate on the suggestion that the expansionary fiscal policy thus far has not yielded any positive results, any real growth, any improvements of people's lives on the ground. And I think it's very important, Chair, for Parliament especially, and for oversight purposes, to really ask the question why that is the case. And I agree with previous speakers that that is largely the case because of misspending, maladministration, and corruption at every level of government. So I really would like to understand whether National Treasury is engaging with other departments. They are reshaping of their specific budgets, and whether there is an engagement with SALGA and the likes on local government finances, and how that needs to change fundamentally. Chair, just thinking on state-owned enterprises and how these are set to change, how they're set to be restructured. What are the plans for the devolution of Latin government? Thinking about Eskom no longer being the sole proprietor of energy and electricity. What are the plans in terms of budgeting going forward for metropolitan governments to purchase electricity directly from independent producers? And the same for the Competition Commission's recommendations that PROSA be unbundled and that Metro Rail movements. Jefferson, we strongly agree with, as I said, most of what National Treasury has mentioned, especially that there are long-run structural weaknesses in the economy that will not be addressed by more spending. We really want to get a sense of what Treasury's response is to the suggestion that expenditure could be reduced even further. We are, as an organization, very acutely aware of waste that occurs systemically in major departments, not to mention bloated compensation, aggregate compensation of public officials, but generally assets and immovable assets in particular that are not used productively. Jefferson, we're very interested in the review of public-private partnership frameworks that was mentioned, and we would like to see some elaboration on that going forward and some more emphasis on that. We know that a lot of corruption has happened at the intersection between the private and public sectors. For that reason, we very much agree and support the public procurement bill. Chair, I would like to just finally request that going forward, and we do look forward to more specific and drastic changes that are going to come in October with the MTBPS, but to really understand, in the meantime, when reference is made to the importance of the renewable energy sector, for example, looking at the current Department of Energy's budget and how money is not added to grid electrification with an emphasis on renewable energy, but rather that money is added to the nuclear energy agenda, is something that how these statements are going to be aligned with at least the interim changes to the budget. Also, Chair, we didn't really see a response to the concern we raised about the Departments of Defense and Police, which have received increased allocations for the short term, really for the 18. Does Treasury not believe that this needs to be reprioritized from existing budgets for those departments? And finally, Chair, just to repeat this, we very much agree that debt stabilization demands structural economic reforms. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you. BJC, are they here in Kululeko? Budget Justice Coalition?
Yes, Chair, they are here.
Okay, please. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, sorry, just switching on my video. I hope you can see me. Good morning, everyone. I want to respond to a few things and then I'll pass on to my colleague Daniel McLaren, who'll take on from there. I think the first and foremost important thing that we want to note here is that this package, which I don't think has adequately been responded to, does not preserve the economy right now, and it's not sufficient. I think that's the most important thing we need to discuss. Secondly, I want to respond to the idea that it's not austerity that's happening. This is a continuous argument. And I want to note that yes, the budget has been expanding, but the budget has been expanding for debt servicing costs. When we did calculations on the February budget, we found that there was a net cut of 48 billion to non-interest expenditure. This is fiscal interest expenditure. I also want to note that there was a comment about fiscal multipliers and how the fiscal multipliers of South Africa were close to zero before the crisis. I do not agree with this comment because UNCTAD's 2019 report showed 7. Even IEJ's calculations of fiscal multipliers is above 1. I do not understand how, within a couple of months, we could have deteriorated from a fiscal multiplier above 1 to close to 0. So I'd like to see more around that evidence. As one of the Treasury people said earlier this week, that Treasury is driven by evidence, but I'm keen to see how we believe that fiscal multipliers in South Africa has deteriorated to 0. The other thing that I wanted to add is to say that we are continuously being reprimanded for wanting more spend, but to actually clarify that it's not just about more spend, it's about how are we spending that money to drive this economy. We do not want spend for the sake of wanting more spend. That's not what civil society is here to do. We are here because we acknowledge that one, spending on poor people, on grants has high, multipliers, because those people have higher marginal propensities to spend. And therefore that helps our domestic markets. But also it does protect those people's livelihoods and it also progresses human rights. I also want to say that in terms of tax, we welcome the fact that there will be tax increases, and we hope that these will not be regressive. We hope that these will tackle high income earners, as our research has shown that there are higher multipliers, economic multipliers, when higher income earners are taxed over poor people. And lastly, I want to say,
Lucy, we can't hear you. Can we move over to your colleague in the meanwhile? Can people hear me?
Can hear you, Chair.
Right. So where's your colleague? Can you be brief, please? We're running out of time. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. Lucy covered most of the substance, I think, of our response. I just want to make a quick addition on our to respond to the kind of tenor of the conversation that began, as well as one or two other quick notes on the substance. So I think the BJC noted what you said in the public hearing, Chairperson, that we need to approach this crisis with some degree of humility. It's unprecedented. The top scientists in the world are struggling to figure out exactly how to respond from a public health. So we're all scrambling for ideas. But what we would suggest as a BJC is that these processes, these hard-won democratic processes, they show that there is a lot of ideas on the table for our government to consider. And we shouldn't be kind of just rejecting them outright. We need a government which is receptive to these ideas, and something which BJC is always asking for, and which we've stepped up in terms of the language which we decided to use in this opportunities for engagement with the executive on the budget planning process, rather than just having these conversations once the Minister of Finance has tabled proposals in Parliament. We've made proposals, and we'd like the Treasury to stakeholders, as well as all kinds of other stakeholders, should be given a chance to engage with departments on their budget submissions, with the MTech committees on the evaluation of those submissions, so that some of these ideas which are coming up from the ground can start to filter through in government. And secondly, this applies not just to new spending, but also on the quality of spending. Their fundamental perspective is actually around the quality of service delivery on the ground. So most organizations are not in communities talking about austerity and deficits and debt. They're talking about how we can get communities access to water, to electricity, to housing, etc. So the BJC is fundamentally concerned with the quality of spending. We're not just calling for more spending. However, we do at the same time recognize an economic, and I'm afraid it is also a political analysis, that austerity as an approach to a fiscal crisis hasn't worked anywhere else. We don't think it will work in South Africa, and we're concerned that the Treasury is a little bit too blind to the impact of budget cuts on poverty, on inequality, on unemployment, and the language of short-term harm that we're hearing from the Treasury. It actually underplays the extent of the damage of these policies, and that's our fundamental argument. So we want more engagement on the substance, and we want more opportunities to get closer together.
Okay. Thanks,
so
Daniel.
Figure out these issues. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, the fiscal study group, are they here?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, very quickly, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Treasury for their response. Just one from our view, we focus.
People, please mute their audio. In Kululeko, help. Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you, Chair. So just in general, our focus is very strongly on fiscal sustainability. One thing that we also see from the Treasury's review now is the problem with a structural low economic growth that we have been experiencing in South Africa, and for us especially that serious impact that it has on state revenue. For us, there should be a stronger focus on the revenue side, as that is the limiting factor in all of these discussions. A lot of the discussions focus more on the expenditures, whereas we think the revenue side is very important. One example is that something like 600,000 individual tax, 20% of government's revenue. So that is scary figures. Just again, we want to also, we like the point about the fact that there was no austerity in the budget for at least the last decade. In fact, the fiscal stance has been very expansionary. Then we also take note of the negative fiscal multiplier, which is a scary place to be at, and again, showing the limited fiscal space or ability of the fiscal side of the economy to stimulate this whole process, and that we really need the old going. And then just looking especially at items like civil service remuneration, social assistance payments, and debt service cost. And just to make the point that we have now reached a point where those three items alone will absorb 100% of government's revenue for this year. Thank you.
Hi, Chair. Mr. Karim.
Kululeko.
Chair.
Who's next online to present?
It was Economist Initiative, but I don't see them online. I'm not too sure if they are here.
Economist Initiative, are you there?
I don't think they are here, Chair. Then the next one is SAICA.
SAICA, can you?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd just like to comment on two things on the presentation. He mentioned that there's a 24% tax to GDP ratio, so I didn't know if I heard correctly or if that's correct, because it doesn't seem to match up with the figures that we've got. And he also said that that the pay-as-you-earn, and that's maybe directed more towards SARS, but that there are pay-as-you-earn deferrals that seem to have declined from April to May. So I'm not sure what has happened there, because I mean, COVID hasn't gone away, so we're uncertain why those defined or the benefits, the tax benefits provided, are reducing, are being used by less people rather than more, or just the same, which is a good thing, but we'd just like more clarity. Speakers have mentioned so far on the expenditure side, and I think it's a major issue. It's not how we spend, or it's not how much we're spending, but what are we spending it on, and what is the quality of our spend. We cannot have another Auditor General report released like it was on Wednesday with the municipalities, the irregular expenditure carrying on year, nothing seeming to be changed, nothing is being done about it. And that links me to accountability. Again, there is no accountability. We do need a unified government, and if National Treasury did say that it was COSATA's view that we need a private sector-led investment to stimulate the economy, we support that, and we'd like to see more activities from the private sector growing and creating jobs, not just investing. That they need to be part of the economy. Getting back to the expenditure side, there's certain expenditure that hasn't been mentioned in the budget. You know, we've mentioned these before, the bailouts for the state-owned entities, the failing infrastructure on water and sewage. Where are these things coming through on the infrastructure spend? We can't see that at the moment. The unsustainable wage rates, they just cannot carry on. No change in that. We know we're at the bargaining council, but we need accountability there as well. And this is shown in the Auditor General's report. We cannot keep spending money where there is no service delivery and no accountability when there is no service delivery. The other thing I want to highlight is with the government funding initiative, can we use those funds? Well, we need to point out that's a defined benefit contribution plan that is guaranteed by taxpayers. So taxpayers will be funding any shortfall resulting from those investments, and it shouldn't be reliant or subject to investment risk. So at this stage, it is underfunded, it's falling short. The investment is going to come down, and taxpayers are going to have accounted for in the budget at this stage. And the other thing is that the guarantees that we are providing there, we need to re-look at those. We cannot carry on in that regard. The National Treasury mentioned this is a crisis, a short-term crisis.
Sharon, can you please summarize?
Yeah, so please, we need accountability. We need to look at expenditure. Our revenue estimates are critical. At this stage, they seem unrealistic, and that determines our expenditure. So if we don't get that right, our expenditure will be excessive, and we need to cut down on our expenditure and have accountability for the expenditure that is not spent properly. Thank you.
Thanks. Honorable Karim, are you back? Okay, let's proceed. Nkululeko Nalan, who's the next to respond?
It was Mr. Peter Mekin.
Mr. Mekin, it's your time now. Can you take 2 minutes and make input?
Yes, yes, I could certainly. I'd be very interested to do. I'm glad I've finally got to speak to you, because something's got to be done here, sir. Something's really missing. 2 years ago, the present Minister of Finance said that income taxes have got to be replaced by land taxes. There was no qualification to that of any importance. Now, not once has from Treasury referred to that fact, and I do think that as your committee must find out what's going on here. Either that's wrong, and therefore we shouldn't go any further. But if it is wrong, why was that made? You see, they said in the MTBPS of 2018, they said income taxes and VAT are inefficient. No, that's enough to suggest that somebody should look at it. And I've had no response to my calculation that means that the cost of living of the average South African family has increased through income taxes and VAT by 70,000 rand per annum. Now, there's no response to that. And Mr. Chairman, I must leave you, please, to find out what's going on. Many thanks.
Thanks, Peter Mekin. Thanks very much. Nkululeko Alan, who's next to respond?
Chair, that concludes the ones that presented. There is a Dr. Greenberg from a civil society that would like to comment. He only made written submissions to the committees.
Can I speak? And make a 2 minutes comment.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity. Look, I'm representing more than 40 civil society organizations in the land and agriculture sector. So just to cut it very simple, we are asking the question why the defense and police budgets have been increased by over 5 billion rand, and the agriculture and fisheries budgets have been cut by more than 3 billion rand in total, specifically targeted at local food security, land reform, local programs for people to produce food. So we don't understand why there's more money going to policing and more money going to short-term things like social grants rather than to productive activity and supporting productive activity. And we're calling for a return of that money so that people can actually become part of the economy as discussed in the reform, the last 2 points in the reform agenda of the department. It's not calling for increased expenditure or anything. It's calling for a return of the money from militarization and policing towards agriculture and food security support. That's all.
Thanks very much. Is he the last amongst the stakeholders?
Yes, Chair. There's nobody else to my knowledge.
I've got PBO Chair. They would like to respond as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Can PBO proceed, Chair?
Yes, 3 minutes, please, Doctor.
Okay. Both myself and my colleague Dumasani and Kisa are going to respond very quickly. And the first point I'd like to make in response to especially the DG said was that there are lots of ways to interpret data and to present other people's views as not fact-based and yours as fact-based when people are, lots of different people are doing empirical work and taking this real seriously is not correct. We are basically arguing for different interpretations of the truth and different views about the truth and also different approaches to economics. And so I'd like to respond to 2 points that especially made by Duncan Peterson. And one of the things that we've been saying, and we've said it in the MTBPS and we've said it before, is that the approach that National Treasury has taken is based on a certain kind of economics view. And one of this is about that high debt leads to lower growth. And there's no support in the economics literature for this. I don't know which studies Duncan is. The work on Reinhardt is where they showed over 90% debt to GDP may start having a small negative impact on GDP growth. Other than that, the work that has come out afterwards responding to Reinhardt and Rogoff has actually shown that even over 100%, you still get a positive impact on GDP growth from debt. The association and the relationship. The second is that their view is based on something called contraction expansion. Basically, if government doesn't spend money and they bring things under control, irrespective of the damage that causes in the economy, the possibility of negative multipliers bringing down GDP, if you increase business confidence, you may get the private sector to invest more. And that study by Alessina and Adania 2009 was found even by the IMF to be empirically wanting. They found that the data was misrepresenting when you had fiscal expansions and fiscal contractions. And so from the economics perspective, that argument really needs to be rethought. And I thought that the BJC people responded to the point about negative multipliers in South Africa really well. And I think I would concur with their view that your multipliers depend on where you spend the money and how effectively it's spent. And in this kind of downturn, if you're providing money to businesses that may go out of business and lose employers and to put tables and to keep their families going, those will have huge multipliers, and we should seriously consider that. And so the last point I want to make before I hand over to Dumasani is actually, sorry, Chair, I think I've taken enough time. Let me hand over to Dumasani and be fair to my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Siraj. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, honourable members. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, colleagues from Treasury. I think, Chair, what I wanted to respond to was just the approach issue of the office. I think what we have chosen to do as an office over the years that we don't necessarily want to engage in a confrontational engagement with government in many regards. And I think what has happened over the past 2 or 3 years, we have been agreeing tacitly with Treasury and that we should engage some of these issues a lot offline. And I think the DG will remember that we have actually been talking about engaging with these things in the recently. So let's meet whereby we engage with these things. So largely, some of these things are contested, as my colleagues have emphasized there. I think we still committed to that discussion offline, not really confrontational engagement. I think on our approach, Chair, and all members, we certainly were established to say way so far as we don't necessarily, I mean, our approach is largely reliant on data, what has evidence, what data is out there, what information is out there, and we present our analysis based on that information. And some of these issues we've raised here, we've raised them long, like Siraj, so we've been raising over the years, and it's not anything new in terms of what, how level of inequality, level of poverty, level of, and how much has been the government response in that regard. And I think it is important for us then, Chair, that these engagements are taken on in that sense, and it doesn't we don't get so confrontational, because at the same time we lose the importance of having debates that are more fruitful for value add for the public finance, for government, or for economy as a whole. I think the issue that I wanted to comment, I think Siraj touched on the issue of the debt. I think the point I wanted to touch on it because I've one of the paper that I've also seen there, Reinhardt and Rogov, which largely argued about the debate around macroeconomic debt levels and macroeconomics, where, obviously it brought us around argument that there is optimal debt level within macroeconomics, which certainly has not really been able to prove that. And I think there was a paper that's sort of trying to critique that paper, shows that actually more growth is more important, because when you have more growth, obviously the ratio becomes more thinner, and because the debt the ratio is based on the growth and two variables, growth and debt, and the more the economy expands, the more the ratio becomes quite thin in that regard. So the point I wanted to say in this is that we should be careful of emphasizing the assumptions that there is optimal debt level in macroeconomics, which has not really been proven in this regard. The second point is on expenditure. When you look at the post global financial crisis situation on countries that have grown and those not grown over the years, you realize that the government spending has always been important. But I think I agree with the colleagues who have emphasized that the issue of around quality of expenditure, because when you look at Greece and Italy in particular, they have government has spent, but because of the quality of spending has not realized growth on any fellow key areas really that you've seen spending being emphasized on. Of course, efficiency of spending is a very important thing here, but also investing in research innovation, very importantly. Also, this investment around technology and human capital formations has seen to be some of the areas that has led to more growth than other kinds of those who have invested a lot of money spending in non-growth or growth areas in that regard. Chair, I just wanted to emphasize the issue of approach and also the fact that we're still open to engage with government in some of this, not necessarily in a confidential issue. Thank you so much, Chair. Thanks.
Who's next? Is it FFC? Alan and Guleko.
Yes, Chair. I think Henry from the FFC did log in. I'm not sure if any of the commissioners are here. Can I also just request the person that took control of the screen, please hand it back to us? Thank you.
Okay. It doesn't look like FFC is here.
Chair?
Yes.
I think in terms of the program, we're supposed to give.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm exiting now because it's your turn to chair. I just want to remind you that actually we're pretty squeezed on time. National Treasury took close to 40 minutes, and then civil society also. I think maybe what we should do is compromise, Comrade Chair, and give National Treasury a few minutes to respond now. Let the members come in, and then Treasury comes in at the end and responds to everybody. But I'll leave it to you now because it's your turn to chair. Thanks.
Person that we leave the program as it is. This is our meeting. We should come at the end. I think they should.
Okay, whatever. Okay.
Yeah, let them come now and try to be as short as possible. Then we have members commenting. Can we move to the next item? Thanks very much, Honorable Karim, for handing over to me, co-chair. Can we move now to Treasury? National Treasury's responses, 15 minutes. I think it's too long for you to respond. Can you try to cut it short? Over to you, Treasurer.
Thank you, Chairperson, honorable members. This is Mampu Modisa speaking, and I'll just be addressing the few questions that we received in terms of spending reductions and spending proposals and reprioritizations. So basically, Chairperson and honorable members, when we were doing this, the first thing that we looked at was what was announced by the President. And what was announced basically was that we will need to reprioritize 130 billion to fund the spending that was announced. So basically what we have done is that initially there were only 4 departments that we identified as frontline services. That was health, social development, police, and the defense force. When we went through with the departments to reprioritize funding, we realized that just because they were not mentioned, it doesn't mean they don't have spending pressures. So when we looked for example, departments such as correctional services, for people who are not adhering to the regulations, it means there was pressure there. So we had to reprioritize from what they would have saved initially because of COVID towards what they need to do to deal with COVID. For example, quarantine sites in the prisons, we had to look at all of that. You have departments such as basic education, where what we have identified is infrastructure grants, not because they are not important, but purely because if the economy is on lockdown, there was no one who was constructing any sites. So basically, we had to look at how much will the departments be able to save for the rest of the year, and we will remove the money, we will reallocate the funding that we think won't be spent for specific program. So in the supplementary budget, we have detailed explanations and amounts of reallocations per department that we will have to come back to the Standing Committee on Appropriations to represent. So basically in basic education, whatever amount we've identified, we also had to look at how much do they need to sanitize the schools? How much do they need to get ready for the schools to reopen? And most of that money was reprioritized back to the department. And then if departments such as the economic growth related departments where you're looking at small business, mental affairs, and these departments will start kicking in, or they will start working properly in phase 3 of where we're looking at, because the president announced phase 1 where it was the response, phase 2 it was making sure that we deal with the vulnerable, and phase 3 would be how do we kickstart growth. So those departments' budgets will have to relook at them when we in phase 3 of dealing with the pandemic. Then what we also had to look at was basically how do we ensure that the departments remain functional. And what we had to do was to make sure that we don't reduce funding that is allocated for non-discretionary items such as your rent, such as the functioning of a department. So most of the reductions that we have will not affect the functioning of the department. And Chairperson and honorable members, there was a lot of comments regarding the social grants and the fact that Treasury has reduced the budgets allocated to social grants, and therefore we're not adhering to what the president has announced. As the Treasury, you always have to look at the numbers. We have been working with social development where we ask them, how are the numbers looking like? Who are the people that qualify in the different criteria? So for example, in terms of the social relief, the SDR grant, the 350, there were 7 million people who applied, and only half of those, Chairperson.
You are requested to switch on your video because this meeting is being recorded. It's on YouTube and other platforms. So see the faces of the participants. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairperson. I was just saying that when we present a budget, we have to look at the numbers. So the reduction in the allocation of social development does not mean we're paying less people because we allocated less. Basically, given the trend, given the criteria, we think deliver the mandate that was announced by the president, but in lesser amount compared to what was announced. So basically, Chairperson, in terms of spending, what we're going to do next, it was announced by the minister, is that we're going to look at spending reviews in an attempt to get to a place where we talk about zero-based budgeting. So the spending reviews will be a starting point for us to get there. So we take cognizant of the fact that most of the government spending is non-discretionary, but the spending reviews will help us not only save if there's savings, but also to come up with different ways to effectively improve the way we do spending in government. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks. Are you the only one responding from Treasury, or someone else will also come? If so, yes, there are more. There's two more colleagues to respond. Mr. Chairman. Okay, can they come in quickly? We're running out of time.
Shall I start with tax? Okay, so Lisa, do you want to start?
No, you go through. I'll come after you. Just sorting our technology here. So go for it.
Okay, thanks, Sipiso. Good morning, members. Good morning, chairs. There were just a couple of questions on tax. I think the one was on the tax to GDP. I think they were referring to 26.4%, not 24. But yeah, it's 26.4% going down to 23. It's in the supplementary budget. Why is the number of firms declining in May after April for the pay-as-you-earn deferral? We can check with SARS on that data. It is preliminary data that's just come in. Maybe there's some of those firms haven't shown up. Just on the revenue estimates, which seem unrealistic, again, I think it's page 34 of the supplementary review that you could just go and have a look at. We've got a big drop in tax to GDP, but the tax to GDP going forward does track quite closely the global financial crisis, and we think it is reasonable. There was the point from Mr. Meekin on land taxes, why has nothing been done? We did publish a slide in response to the same submission 2 years ago. I mean, just to read the slide quickly that we did respond, we didn't agree to get rid of income taxes and replace with a land tax. It was just saying that National Treasury recognizes the potential improvements in efficiency from land taxes as highlighted by the OECD in their report, Taxation and Economic Growth. But we did say, however, the Davis Tax Committee had done some work on this, and they'd raised some what we thought were valid concerns about it moving to a full land use tax instead of income taxes, that it may create a less diversified tax base, there are cash flow issues, and it may lead to some high income individuals facing lower tax charges. So it has been something that we've been thinking about, and we do get a lot of proposals on different tax structures each year, but we can't obviously go ahead with all of them. So it is still one of those that we do look at. That's everything from...
Thanks, Chris, and good morning to Parliament and honourable members. There was a question about borrowing and also utilising the national revenue cash balances. Why not do that? Why do we need to go to the IFIs or the international financial institutions to consider financing of government? I think very clear in the budget, we do stipulate how we are funding this budget deficit. And it is delineated through local funding, international funding, and it also utilizes the cash that we have. And unfortunately, we cannot run down the cash such that we are not able to operate. You need to have a positive cash balance, honorable members, and that is what we are safeguarding. So we are using all that to respond to the shock. And it's very important that there is no one at this point in time who's expecting a country not to be increasing their level of debt. That is an expected response to the shock, and all the resources that we are tapping into reflect exactly that. I think the challenge, honorable members, is if we think even over the medium term, we can continue spending the way we are. And we are not certainly saying borrowing is bad, but we are saying unproductive borrowing is bad because it, in terms of stimulating investment, it's not coming back through revenue increases, and therefore the ability for government to be able to repay. As we speak right now, it would be amiss if we do not disclose the fact that the primary deficit means that we do not generate enough revenue, one, to service non-interest expenditure, two, to even service interest expenditure. And that means that every time there is a budget deficit, there is a budget deficit plus the redemptions that needs to be paid back. And that is something that is not normally very clear, because what it says is that Tepiso will borrow for the budget deficit of the main budget, but I'm also borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. And that is not sustainable. It means we are not in control. And if we do not acknowledge that, certainly what my colleagues have already alluded to in the form of a sovereign debt crisis is a reality. And the question that honorable members are going to ask us at that point in time would be, where was Treasury when this thing was happening. And I just want to caution that history should note that these things are real. They've happened to many countries, and we can see that if we do not do the right things around how we finance and how we manage our debt, we are going to find ourselves in a very difficult situation. Our strategy has changed. We have not been borrowing from multilaterals. Most of their funding is very project-based, and as you know, we fund a national revenue fund that is not really segregated in projects. And for the first time now, they are making resources available, and some of these resources are once-off. There is no certainty that the $7 billion that we are looking to raise from multilaterals will continue on the outer years. It's very clear that it is for a specific purpose, to respond to COVID and ensure that we are able to finance all the objectives that we have stated, and including the package that the president has announced. The savings of this country, honorable members, they are there to be seen. They are very meager. We are talking about approximately 4.5% of gross saving rate. And at the level at which this funding is increasing, it is certainly eating up on that portion that is available. International investors as well have sold quite a lot since the downgrades have happened. And people would say, but why worry about downgrades? We are already junk. As we know, honorable members, even in junk, there are various levels. And the risk premium that you pay to be able to service this debt. So it is absolutely important that we reflect on that, and we are able to, in a very responsible way, manage the cash balances of government. It would be an unfortunate day where we have to ration cash because we are, as a government, running negative cash balances, and because there's no understanding that resources are not infinite, but there are finite level of resources that would need to be deployed. And we certainly are deploying this cash to productive